Okay, welcome everybody to FAIR's monthly webinar series. My name is Lynn Hewen and I'm FAIR's National Director of Education Initiatives as well as your moderator for today's presentation on participating in a clinical trial, what you need to know. A little bit of housekeeping just before we get started. As with all of FAIR's webinars, this presentation will be recorded and posted on the FAIR website in about 7 to 10 days. Please note that for maintaining a quality recording, all attendees will be muted throughout the webinar today. If time allows, at the end of the presentation, we will have an opportunity to take questions. Because attendees will be muted, we ask that you please submit these via our questions feature in your GoToWebinar panel, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen. One disclaimer is that I did want to note that today's presentation, while we will be talking about particular clinical trials and that are ongoing and the research setting, today's presentation is really geared to sort of talk about the clinical trial process and to talk about to provide information for individuals interested in participating in a trial. It's not intended to interpret or assess or provide commentary on specific ongoing research studies. For those of you that are on Twitter, we encourage you to join us in conversation during the broadcast, and you can follow along with us during our webinar live tweets at our handle @foodallergy or #FairWebinar. All of FAIR's resources and education programs, including our free webinars, are made possible through community support. If you'd like to make a tax-deductible gift or become a FAIR member to advance our mission efforts and our ongoing webinar series, you can do so at foodallergy.org/donate. So at this point, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our presenter today, and then I'll turn the presentation over to him. Dr. Todd Green is with us from Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh of UPMC. Sorry, I'm just having a little bit of technical issues on my end really quickly, so bear with me just a moment. Stand by, I'll be right with you all. Okay, sorry about that. Dr. Green did complete his fellowship in allergy and immunology at Duke University Medical Center in 2006, and while at Duke, he developed an interest in caring for food allergic patients and their families, and he had the opportunity to participate in some of the early oral immunotherapy, or OIT, studies under the mentorship of Dr. Wesley Burks. He's been on the faculty at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine since 2006, where he is currently the Associate Professor of Pediatrics. He directs the FAIR Clinical Network Center of Excellence at Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh of UPMC, as well as the Allergy Immunology Fellowship Training Program at UPMC. So at this time, I am going to go ahead and turn the webinar over to him. So I'd like to thank Dr. Green for being with us and taking time away to present on this really important topic. So Dr. Green, the presentation is all yours.
Great, thanks, Lynn. I really appreciate the opportunity to give this talk today, and have enjoyed working with FAIR over the years, and really appreciate the partnership that we've established with FAIR at our medical center. All of you on the call really know all about all the great things that this organization has done and is going to continue to do in the future. So thank you all for supporting it, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you all today. So as Lynn mentioned, I'm going to be talking in general about clinical trials for food allergy, and going into a little bit of some of the specific trials that are out there, but really focusing more on the process. Why talk about food allergy clinical trials at all? You all probably are very familiar with many of these facts. So food allergies are common. They affect up to 15 million Americans. Approximately 1 in 13 children has a food allergy, which equates to about 2 in every classroom. There's been this increase, estimated at 50% between 1997 and 2011, in food allergies. And food allergies can be quite serious, as you know. So 200,000 emergency department visits annually are estimated to be due to food allergic reactions. About every 3 minutes, someone is seen in an emergency department for a food allergic reaction. And food allergies are the leading cause of anaphylactic reactions that occur outside of the hospital setting. Currently, our treatment for food allergy consists of avoidance, which primarily involves reading labels and asking questions and being very vigilant in settings such as ice cream parlors and restaurants and birthday parties, and then being ready to manage an accidental ingestion reaction. So we do this through things like having a food allergy action plan and making sure that we have access to epinephrine at all times. And when things go well, these reactions can be avoided, and when accidental exposures occur, they can be treated quickly with medications. But there are obviously many shortcomings to this approach, and these lead to a lot of problems with quality of life and just general adverse effects with living with food allergy that I know all of you are very familiar with. So where we really would like to be with food allergy is to either prevent a reaction, and that's can be done through either inducing tolerance or desensitization to a food, or really trying to prevent the allergy from occurring in the first place. So there are multiple approaches being studied to treat food allergy, and all of these fall under the category of what we think of as active therapy, as opposed to avoidance and being ready to manage a reaction. So I think the three that people have heard the most about probably are oral immunotherapy, sublingual immunotherapy, and epicutaneous immunotherapy, also known as OIT, SLIT, and EPIT. There are other things that are further back in the pipeline, and I think many of us imagine that the way we treat food allergies in 5 years is going to be very different from the way we treat it now, and then the way we treat it in 10 or 20 years will be different again. So I think we really are at an exciting time in treating food allergy, and I think it's just going to change and hopefully get better and better. But because these therapies are being discussed so widely, and all of a sudden families now have access to these studies, when just a few years ago you really didn't have easy access to these studies unless you were in a couple of places around the country, I thought it would be useful just to talk about clinical research in general. So we have many unanswered questions with food allergy. So these are just some of them. Why do some people develop food allergy? Why do some family members develop them, but not all? Why do some people outgrow their food allergies, but not everybody does? Why are some food allergies outgrown more than other foods? How important is the age of introduction? What's the role of eczema in food allergy? Do antibiotics affect the onset of food allergy? What's the role of the microbiome? Does vitamin D matter? Can we treat food allergy once it develops? Can we prevent food allergy from occurring? Can we identify who is most at risk from a severe reaction? And I'm sure we all could probably fill many pages with more of these questions. To answer these questions, many of them, we need clinical trials. And to do clinical trials, we need you and participants like you to get these studies done. But I also think it's really important to have an understanding for what a trial involves and what it's about before you just jump into one. So I'm hoping this will be a helpful talk in that regard. So the World Health Organization defines a clinical trial broadly as any research study that prospectively assigns human participants or groups of humans to one or more health-related interventions to evaluate the effects on human outcomes. Let me just see. These can be broadly subdivided into observational and interventional trials, and I'm going to go a little bit more into how to further subdivide them. But you can think of an observational trial as a trial of a drug or treatment, drug or treatment is not being tested, and these can be important to generate ideas about causes, associated factors, or potential treatments. So they're more just trying to capture the way things are and really understand the current state of things, and those can be very helpful in developing other studies, as opposed to interventional studies that involve attempts to modify disease. So these involve treating a current allergy or preventing development of allergy. And the concept of placebo is important. I'll talk more about that later. But the best studies involve a placebo part as well as a treatment part. And that's important when you're thinking about whether to enroll yourself or your child in a study. Clinical trials often start with an idea, and often they come from a lab study, either in animal or sometimes in cells from humans, but they can also come from a clinical observation. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the LEAP study that's been in the press over the past year, and then the LEAP-ON study that came out just recently. And that was an extremely important study and has really changed the way we approach young children at risk for developing peanut allergy. And it started from a clinical observation, which was that peanut allergy in Israel was seen very infrequently, and especially when compared with a similar genetically similar group of children in the United Kingdom who had much more peanut allergy. And the only difference seemed to be that in Israel, kids were introduced to peanut at an early age. And so that observation led to the LEAP study, which was an extremely well-performed study that led to some pretty astounding results, I think, in the direction we all expected, but even more dramatically so. So these clinical observations are very important in developing an idea for a trial. From there, a protocol is developed, and I'll talk more about that later as well. But the protocol really is designed to answer a specific question or a set of specific questions, and everything in the study is around those questions. So the protocol is very specific as far as describing participants that will be involved in the study, any tests that will be a part of the study, procedures that are required for the study, the length of the study, and any information that will be collected. There are a number of mechanisms in place to ensure the safety of a clinical trial, and the Institutional Review Board is one of the most important ones. So the IRB is the organization that's in charge of approving and monitoring the study, and this is in place for the protection of participants. The IRB reviews the safety and ethical factors of the study, and I'll say more about that later as well. So I just like this cartoon to take a pause for a second. It's important not only to know what questions to ask, but what to do with the results. So you can see these scientists are trying to understand what these dolphins are saying, and they're diligently recording these sounds and not realizing that these sounds are actually the dolphins speaking Spanish to them. So we have to really know how to analyze the data and not just to know what questions to ask. So clinical trials, I mentioned interventional versus observational studies. They can also be subdivided into these types of studies. So a natural history study looks at how a disease progresses over time. So with respect to food allergy, this would be a cohort study where you take a group of children with milk allergy or egg allergy, and they're followed going forward in time, and it's captured what happens with their skin test results or their blood test results, and factors such as who's outgrowing it and at what age they're outgrowing it are able to be captured as well. So it's, again, just looking at things the way they are without an intervention. Prevention studies look at stopping a disease before it starts, or else stopping it from returning once it starts. So the LEAP study would be an example of a prevention study where kids at risk for peanut allergy based on a history of egg allergy or a history of severe eczema. Half of those children were given an intervention of eating peanut early, and the other half were told to avoid it until age 5. And the outcome was whether kids were allergic to peanut at age 5. A screening study involves detecting the disease as early as possible. So this could be a study where kids at a young age are skin tested or receive serum testing to try to identify who may be allergic at an early age to see whether an intervention might be possible. Diagnostic studies involve finding a better way to detect the allergy. So I know many of you are familiar with component testing, and that's increasingly an area that we're studying with food allergy to try to improve our ability to make a diagnosis of food allergy based on a test other than a food challenge. So looking at food component testing is one type of a diagnostic study. Treatment studies involve new therapies or else combinations of old therapies to try to treat a disease. So these would be the OIT studies or the epicutaneous studies that I know are talked about a lot and that many of you know about. And then quality of life studies involve understanding and hopefully improving what it is like to live with a chronic illness. So there's a nice body of literature looking at quality of life with food allergy. Many of them involve survey studies, trying to ask parents and kids and other people affected with food allergy what it's like to live with a food allergy and how that impacts their daily functioning. So if you're thinking about a clinical trial, it can be helpful to try to understand what type of a study it is that you're actually considering for yourself or for your child. So I mentioned before that treatment studies typically involve a placebo arm, and the best studies involve a placebo arm. So a placebo is an inactive medication or treatment, and it won't affect the subject in a good way or a bad way. But the idea is that the subject does not know whether he or she is receiving the treatment or the placebo. And the group receiving the placebo is known as the control group. It's very important to compare potential drugs or treatments with placebo. There's a phenomenon where anytime somebody's in a study, just by the fact that they are being observed closely and that they're paying more attention to their disease, very often people's diseases will improve just by being in the study itself. And so controlling for that placebo effect is really important so that you don't overestimate the effect of the drug or the treatment. So here's somebody comparing placebos versus fast-acting extra-strength placebos. And he's going to opt for the fast-acting extra-strength ones, just because that sounds better. So randomized trials, many trials you'll hear referred to as randomized clinical trials or randomized controlled trials. And in these studies, subjects are assigned to one of various treatment groups. So there can be two groups. There can be a treatment arm and a placebo arm, or there can be more than two groups. There could be, if you're looking at a new pill, for example, there could be several different doses of the pill, and there can be a placebo arm. But the key thing is that the subjects are assigned at random. And the very best studies are done in a double-blind fashion, which means that the participants don't know which group they're in, and the people doing the study also don't know which group they're in. So it's usually done through like computerized randomizing or some other way where a random number is generated, and the people who are performing the study aren't aware of what the subject's receiving, and the subject isn't aware either. So there are also single-blind studies where only the participants are unaware. And it's important to know that it's always possible to unblind in a study for safety concerns. So if there's ever any concern during the study that somebody's having some very harmful effect from the intervention, unblinding can happen, because the first thing with all of these studies is safety. But hopefully it's apparent why a double-blind study is really the best kind of study, where the patient or the subject is being observed in a way where the investigators don't know what the person's receiving, so that they're not biased at all. So there's 4 phases to a clinical trial. They each have a different purpose. They're essential to answer questions before the drug gets approved. And really the first 3 are the ones that happen before approval. It's a long process, and I know with food allergy in particular, the length of that process is very frustrating, but it's important to establish safety. And so it's really crucial to go through all these phases to make sure that a drug has been well studied and is safe before it's made available to the public. But it can take 15 years or more from discovery of a drug to approval by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. There's a recent study that estimated that developing a new drug, a new prescription medicine, from the start to the finish costs $2.6 billion. And I know some people think that's an underestimate, but it's a long process. It's a very expensive process. And so it can be very frustrating, especially when you have something like food allergy where we don't have any other treatment. But it is, for safety reasons, it's really important for the whole process to play out. So even before a phase 1 study begins, a company needs to submit what's called an investigational new drug application to the FDA, and that includes information on the drug. It has information about previous studies that have been done, often in preclinical studies. And if the FDA reviews the IND application, the investigational new drug application, and decides that there's good preliminary data, then they will tell the sponsor, whoever's planning to do the study, that a phase 1 study can begin, as long as the trial seems to include adequate consent and protection from risk is assured. So once that process happens, then a phase 1 study can begin. And the key thing to know about a phase 1 study, these are small studies. They're generally shorter studies, so it depends on the disease, but typically they can be a few weeks or a month or up to a year. They don't usually go much longer than that, and they involve a small group of subjects. The primary focus is on safety. So they'll also look at tolerability. If it's a drug, they may be looking at a route of administration, so whether the drug should be administered orally, or is it an inhaled medication or IV, but they may be trying to determine that with a phase 1 study, and they look at side effects. So they're not looking at how well this is actually treating the disease. It's just a small safety study to make sure that this drug is not doing anything harmful or something that would automatically disqualify it from going forward. So the idea is you do this quickly with a small group to decide whether to proceed forward. So a food allergy example would be food allergy herbal formula. I know many of you are familiar with, just looking at safety and tolerability of it, making sure people could take it, that it was not doing anything harmful to them, there were no very harmful side effects, but not looking at all of whether it was treating food allergy. So if everything looks safe in the phase 1 study, phase 2 can proceed, and these are larger studies. It can be up to a couple hundred participants. It depends on the disease process, how many participants will be needed. In phase 2 studies, the same treatment is studied. These can be longer, up to about 2 years, and here efficacy is looked at for the first time. Safety continues to be looked at, and safety is looked at through all 4 phases. But phase 2 is really where efficacy starts to be looked at for the first time. Tolerability and side effects are also monitored. So many of you probably heard about peanut oral immunotherapy phase 2 results that were just released at our big national meeting, the Quad AI meeting. And I'll talk about the oral immunotherapy study that's now in a phase 3 study, but that went forward because the phase 2 studies were encouraging. And so it was peanut OIT looking at the initial outcome, like were kids able to ingest more peanut at the end of the study than they could at the beginning. So once you move beyond the safety of phase 1, you can go to phase 2 where efficacy is looked at. Phase 3, the studies get bigger, and these often involve more centers. So phase 2 may be 1 or a couple of centers. Phase 3 studies often involve multiple centers, and it can involve up to a few thousand patients for some diseases. Food allergy studies don't typically go to that large of a number, but the idea is that these studies they capture more people, and so if there are any problems or concerns, they're more likely to be identified, and also we can more confidently assess the results. So phase 3 studies should have a placebo arm where they're comparing the drug or the treatment with a placebo. They can involve determining the best dose for a drug. And again, safety is always looked at in these studies, side effects, and efficacy again. So once a phase 3 study is complete, the sponsor of the study will review the results and then decide whether to submit a new drug application to the FDA for approval. So after the FDA gets the application, the FDA reviews it and decides whether to approve. And the timing of that process is variable and it's hard to predict. But it's important to make sure that all the necessary information about safety has been assessed and that the drug seems to be efficacious or effective before it's approved. So there are 2 current phase 3 studies for food allergy, and this is the first time we've had phase 3 studies for food allergy, so it's part of what makes this such an exciting time in food allergy, because we are on the cusp, hopefully, of having at least one or maybe both of these studies be approved. So there's an oral immunotherapy product, and there's a epicutaneous immunotherapy product, both looking at peanut allergy, and there are also studies in the works to look at other foods as well with these therapies. But I know many of you are aware of these phase 3 studies, and I'll talk a little bit more about those later, but I'm not going to go a lot into those studies in particular, just to mention that it is exciting that we have 2 phase 3 studies. Phase 4 then occurs after the drug's approved by the FDA and available to the public, and this involves continued monitoring through information that's collected regarding safety. The information is collected to make sure that the drug still is safe once it starts being used in a wide fashion, and there are multiple instances where drugs have been recalled after approval because of information that comes up later. So it's important to continue to monitor it even after you're out of the phase 3. Sorry about that. And this is a nice just cartoon schematic of the clinical trial process. So you can see phase 1 typically is short, involves a small number of people. Safety is the most important thing. They're looking at side effects in these studies. You can see as you progress through the phases, safety continues to be the most important thing. But phase 2 efficacy is looked at for the first time. Phase 3, the studies get bigger. And after phase 3, if it's successful, the sponsor submits it to the FDA for approval, and then it's made available to the public. So now that you're fully recovered, Mr. Dawkins, we can tell you the truth. The 12-hour operation, the intravenous meals, the 3 weeks of bed rest, all were part of an elaborate placebo effect. Hopefully that doesn't usually happen. So I'm going to talk now about who is involved with the study. So who's on your team when you do a study? Because I've alluded to some of these things, but if you've never been part of a clinical research study, I think it can be helpful to know exactly who you're going to meet and what the players are, who the players are. So the sponsor can be a different type of organization. Could be the sponsor. So this could be a medical center or a university, could be a foundation like FAIR, could be a federal agency, it could be a pharmaceutical company. But the sponsor is the one that develops the study design, monitors the progress of the study, and is responsible for reporting unwanted or unintended events to the FDA. And the sponsor submits the application to FDA for approval of the treatment or the drug after the phase 3 study. So very frequently, these are pharmaceutical companies, and with the 2 current phase 3 food allergy studies, they are both pharmaceutically sponsored studies. So you will meet a principal investigator if you're involved in a research study, and that's the person who leads the research team at your particular center. So one study will have multiple PIs or principal investigators at various sites around the country or around the world. So the principal investigator has background and training to oversee the clinical research study. The PI sees participants at visits and is responsible for monitoring the safety and health of participants at that center throughout the study. The PI works closely with a research coordinator or coordinators to ensure that the study is done correctly. The PI also may work with sub-investigators or co-investigators at their study, and those are also people with research experience who share the same responsibilities, but are not the primary person at the site for carrying out the study. The research coordinator, if you've ever been in a study, you know that the research coordinator is frequently the person that you are talking to the most. So this is your main point of contact during the trial. The research coordinator may be a nurse or a nurse practitioner, or maybe somebody from a different type of health background. They are responsible for coordinating day-to-day study activities. They help recruit participants, they collect and manage the data, and they keep the PI and the rest of the team informed about the subject's health, any problems with the study, etc. And then the research participant is obviously the most important member of the team. So when you are a participant in a study, you are a subject, you're not a patient any longer. And I think it's important to just think about the difference a little bit. When you or your child is in a research study, it's a different experience than being a patient in an office where you're receiving a medication that's already been studied and already been approved, and the physician can feel comfortable saying, this is a drug that we think will help you. When you're a subject as opposed to a patient, you have to realize that you're helping us helping us learn whether the drug or treatment is effective. And so we don't really know it is. We think it probably will be, and that's why it's gotten to this point where we're doing this study. But we don't know that for sure. And it can be a subtle difference, but I think it's important to really think about before you go into a study that you're not really a patient. Your role is different. There's less flexibility when you're in a study also because you need to follow a protocol. So when you're a patient and you're in the office talking with your physician about options, there may be 2 or 3 different options or more, and there may not be one clear approach, and you may come up with a unique approach just for you. But when you're in a research study, it's really important to get the best results from the study that the protocol be followed. So those are some of the parts of just what makes being a subject unique and different from being a patient. It's also important to realize that you're a volunteer, or your child is a volunteer for these studies. You don't have to do these studies. You can withdraw at any time. And as a participant, you have protected rights that are written. So you have the right to know everything about your or your child's role in this study. And it's really important to ask questions and have a good understanding of anything in the study. I think sometimes people feel a little bit uncomfortable. They want to be in the study so badly, and so they don't always ask all the questions they have. But it's important to remember that we really value your participation in these studies, and they're helping us learn. And it's very important for you to feel a full part of the process and to understand exactly what's happening. You also have responsibilities. So there's an informed consent form that you sign when you're in a study, and it's important to understand it and not to sign it without really thinking about what you're signing up for. There are study visits. In order to get the best results from a study, we need you to attend those visits. We need you to take the medication or do the intervention and follow the study requirements. Because if we don't have participants that are carrying out the study the way it was designed, we won't get results that we can trust. And so it's really important to take those responsibilities seriously and make sure your child understands them as well. So I've mentioned a couple times, safety is always the highest priority, and this should be the first thought for the entire study team at all points during the study. You should always feel that you can raise concerns that you have about safety at any point along the way, from the very first visit till the very last visit. If you have any questions at all, you need to make sure you're comfortable bringing them up with your PI or your research coordinator. The government does have guidelines in place to keep the risks as low as possible, and there are organizations related to the trial that also monitor for safety that I'll talk about. But some of it also falls on you as the parent or the participant in the study to raise your concerns. So I've mentioned FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, is the federal agency that approves all clinical trial protocols and ensures that procedures are being followed. So the FDA will review results and determine whether the new drug or therapy will be approved, and that comes right after the phase 3 study. The IRB I've mentioned reviews the study. The IRBs can be located within a hospital or university, or maybe an independent group. IRBs review the protocol to ensure that participants' rights are protected and that the risk is minimized. So before the study is allowed to start, someone at the IRB or teams of people at the IRB will review it and make sure that it looks like everything's being done in a way that's ethical and a way that's protecting the rights of participants in a way that risk is minimal. Everybody understands that in order to push science forward and develop new treatments, there sometimes are risks that need to be taken. Part of the IRB's job is to make sure that the risks are minimized. So typically on the IRB there are physicians as well as other healthcare providers and also members of the general public who bring a different perspective. There's the Data Safety Monitoring Board. That's an independent committee of clinical research experts that reviews data in ongoing trials and that monitors for potential problems or risk. So you can feel somewhat assured that there are these structures in place to keep you safe and to make sure that this is being done in an ethical way. But again, you should not take lightly your responsibility as a participant or as a parent of a participant. So those are some of the nuts and bolts. And then once you get into the study, there's usually 4 kind of discrete steps. And I'll just go through those now. So the first is the protocol. The protocol, as I've mentioned, is the plan for how the study is going to be conducted. The protocol lays out who can participate in the study, who can't participate in the study, what the procedures are going to be and when those will occur, the number of the study visits, and the length of the study. And I've mentioned it must be followed exactly. That's both because of safety and to ensure that the results collected are valid. So when you're about to embark on a study for yourself, or your child's about to start a study, you can sit down and look at it and know exactly when these visits will occur. Often there's like a time frame, like visit 3 will be 4 to 6 weeks after visit 2 and has to be a certain number of weeks before visit 4, for example. But it's all spelled out ahead of time. You'll know when the blood draws are going to happen, when the skin test will happen. So this is all stuff that's reviewed and thought about ahead of time. And it's, as I mentioned, it's really important to keep those study visits and make sure that things are being done in a consistent way. And this is part of what makes being in a study different from being a patient in a practice, where we have the flexibility to change things as we go along. Obviously, safety is the most important thing, and we can always discontinue your participation in the study, or you can discontinue your participation in the study. But in general, we want to try to follow the protocol, and in order to get the best results from the study, we need to be really strict with the protocol. Excuse me. So once the protocol is approved and agreed upon, recruitment is the next step for us and we investigators starting a study. So word of mouth is a very important way we recruit for these studies, and we depend on all of you for this. So food allergy support groups and listservs and social media have been hugely important and valuable parts of food allergy research in particular. It's amazing how you all help spread the word with these studies, but we really appreciate it. Physician referrals are helpful also, as we try to have our colleagues spread the word to their patients. Advertisements, sometimes you'll hear an ad on the radio or in a newspaper looking for participants. The internet in general can be a good way to try to recruit studies. But I think with food allergy, if you ask most food allergy researchers, they would say word of mouth is probably our most effective tool. And I just want to thank you all and express my gratitude for helping spread the word with these studies, because it really makes doing these studies and recruiting for the studies much easier, especially compared to some of the other diseases we help study. And that will hopefully lead us to treatment faster. So it's a great team effort. There are several online sources for finding studies, and I just wanted to go through a couple of these with you today. So I know many of you are aware of the current studies that are out there. There will be more studies coming down the road. And so if you want to stay involved with these, FAIR has a lot of great information on its website about clinical research. So I always encourage my patients to look at the FAIR website regularly. Clinicaltrials.gov is a service of the National Institutes of Health. And on that site, there's information about both publicly and privately supported clinical studies. And I'll show you that website in a minute. There's a national patient registry called researchmatch.org that FAIR has partnered with to create a food allergy sub-registry. So you can sign up on this to learn of studies. There's no obligation. This is just a way to be connected with possible food allergy research studies. Centerwatch.com has a listing of industry-sponsored clinical trials. So you can see here's Research Match. You can see that they have announced this partnership with FAIR. If you click Join Now, it brings you to this page where you can get started. If you click the next button, and I didn't go through all of these screens, but it's a way to fill in information about you or your child to be able to learn about these studies. So again, that's Research Match. And then clinicaltrials.gov, I think a lot of you probably are familiar with. So this is the NIH service that lists both industry-sponsored and publicly funded studies. So you can, in the search for studies box, I typed in here peanut epicutaneous immunotherapy. And then if you type search, you can see on the top it says recruiting, and that's the Viaskin peanut study that I know many of you know about. If you click on that, it'll then give you information about the study. They have inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. They have a list of participating centers and whether they're recruiting. They also list contact information for those centers. So this is just a great site to visit periodically to learn about all sorts of studies. And you can scan through quickly and see, you may see this particular study may be looking for kids too young for your child or too old for your child, or they only want kids with this certain food allergy. But it's a good way to do your own research and then be able to talk to specific centers where you think you might want to be, have your child enrolled. So here's Center Watch, and this is the industry-sponsored studies. So you can search for studies here, and you search by medical condition. So here I went to allergy, and here's, you can see it says allergy clinical trials, and I just scanned down to Pennsylvania where I'm in practice, and then you can see in Pittsburgh, this is our center. It says a clinical trial seeking patients for a research study for the treatment of peanut allergy. And this is the A-Immune study, the oral immunotherapy peanut study. So you can see it says the purpose is to demonstrate efficacy and safety of AR-101, which is the oral immunotherapy product, through reduction in clinical reactivity to peanut allergen in peanut allergic children and adults. You can see you can click eligibility and site locations. So it's another good source for information. So I've kind of alluded to screening, but screening is the next step in the process after you've been recruited for a study, and that's where eligibility is determined. And it's important for researchers, but also for you or for your children to look at the criteria closely before deciding to proceed. So there are inclusion criteria, and those are a list of what participants must have in order to be in a study. And then there are exclusion criteria, and those are what participants must not have. These are some things that might be looked at with both inclusion and exclusion criteria. Age, so very frequently we're just focusing on one age group with a study. The food that the child's allergic to obviously is important. The reaction history. A study may be looking for children that have had a reaction to a food and had a positive test, and that were not just diagnosed based on a positive test, or they may be looking for only children with certain types of reactions. There may be minimum criteria set for a skin test or a blood test. Other diseases could be exclusion or inclusion criteria. A study may not want children with very severe asthma for safety reasons, or for similar reasons may not want patients who already have eosinophilic esophagitis. Other diseases may also be involved. Certain medications may be thought to be too risky with a certain product that's being studied, so those could be exclusion criteria. Family history may also be involved, but it's important really to look at those closely before you decide whether this is a study for you, and it's also important for the investigators to look at those. So then informed consent, once you think you've met inclusion and exclusion criteria, informed consent comes next, and this is part of what makes you an active member of the research team. This provides key facts about the trial before you decide whether to participate. It explains all parts of the study, the purpose of the study, the procedures involved, whom you'll contact if there are any problems or questions, what the risks are, what the potential benefits are, and then what your responsibilities are as a participant. And this, as I mentioned, is something you really want to read closely and think about carefully before you sign. It's also important to realize that this is a learning process that continues throughout the study. So informed consent is not something that just happens once and then you're done, but it allows you to ask questions before and during and even after the study. So you should always feel that you are an engaged, active part of this process. And you should also realize that even if your particular allergist is the person doing the study, if you decide to not participate in the study, that will not affect the clinical care that your child receives. So those two things should be completely disconnected, the care you receive in clinic and being in the study. Their studies are completely voluntary, and it should not in any way affect the clinical care you receive. It's also not a contract. I think sometimes when people sign it, they feel like they're committing themselves to the study, absolutely, and we obviously want people to finish the study, and we can't get good information unless we get enough people completing the study and carrying out all parts of it adequately. But at the same time, this is not a contract, and this is voluntary, and you can stop participating at any time. So working with children presents some special issues because they are not always able to fully understand the study, and they're also not always legally able to give consent. So according to human subject research regulations, a child is defined as a person who has not attained legal age for consent to treatments or procedures involved in research under the applicable law of the jurisdiction where the research is being conducted. So the age of adulthood varies by state and also by local law. Very often this age is 18, but it's not always 18, so it really depends on your state and your jurisdiction, and there can be exceptions for emancipated minors as well. The age where a child can consent may vary based on the particular treatment or the procedure as well. So it's important to ask in your particular case what the age is. And then assent is different from consent. So when children are legally too young to give consent, they may still assent to a study. And this is defined as a child's affirmative agreement to participate in research. So this is the attempt for us to have children be aware as much as possible of what they're embarking upon and what they're going to be a participant in. We don't want kids in a study just because they didn't say no. We want them to really understand what's happening to the best of their ability and to want to be in the study. So we're looking for a child to show active willingness to participate, not just to be there because their parents said to be there or to just not say no. So as best as children are developmentally able, we need them to be able to think about what they're doing and understand why they're there. The IRB is the one that is charged with the responsibility for judging the children's capacity to assent for a proposed study, or it may do so on an individual basis. So the age of assent varies based on somewhat on the nature of the study, as well as the age, maturity, and psychological state of the children involved with that study. For adolescents, assent generally includes information similar to what would be provided for adult informed consent. So even if they're too young legally to give informed consent, the information very often is identical or very similar. It should describe to the child what the experience will be like. And as I mentioned, it should allow the child to understand to the best of her or his abilities what their participation will involve. So once all that happens and consent form is signed, the study can begin. And the heart of doing a clinical research study is the study visits. So the number of the visits varies by the trial. Typically, they take place in an office or research center, but some studies also involve home visits. Some studies require home activities like a symptom diary or entering certain data every day. Visits may involve procedures. With allergy studies, our most common procedures are skin tests, blood tests, and pulmonary function tests. It's very important also to stay in touch with the research team in between visits. So you should have a way to contact your research team at any time. And if you ever have any questions during the study, you should not hesitate to reach out. So making the decision to participate can be hard. So after going through all that, it sounds like it's a lot, and it's not something that you should take lightly. And I hope I haven't talked you out of it, because there are a lot of reasons to participate. We need people to participate to help us advance food allergy knowledge. I think being in a study often helps you feel that you're taking an active role in managing your disease, and I think that sense of control or being active can be very empowering. Potentially, this gives you access to new treatments before they're available. So again, we do these to see whether they work. We don't know whether they're working. There's a chance you're going to get a placebo, but you do potentially have access to a new therapy before it's approved. I think being in a food allergy study also allows you to receive care through the study at a center with food allergy expertise. And this just gives me a chance to mention the FAIR Clinical Network that's been established over the past year with a group of centers that are trying to establish some uniformity in the way we treat and approach food allergy and do more collaborative research so that we can all really pool our resources and help to advance the field together. And if you look at the FAIR website, you can see the list of these centers and see if there's one near you. And this list, we anticipate, is going to be growing as well. So I've mentioned your responsibilities as a participant or as a parent, and part of that is asking questions. So I just have a list of questions which you could use if you were thinking about being in a study. So always first, what's the purpose? You want to know what are the main questions being asked here. You want to know what the background of the study is. Why did researchers think that this might work? Does it seem like it's something that makes sense to you? What are the study requirements and expectations? So what will you or your family members have to do, and what will your child have to do? Does it sound like something that's doable for you guys? Will the study potentially benefit my child, and how? What kind of tests are involved? Are they stressful, painful, risky? Will hospitalization be necessary? How will the study visits fit into our family's schedule? Many of these studies involve a lot of visits, and a lot of the visits are long, and so you really need to think hard about, is this doable for you guys? And then will we receive the study results? Will my child need to stop any current treatments during the trial? And how do the possible risks, side effects, and benefits compare with current treatment? And I think this is one of the most challenging things with food allergy research, because if we think about just avoiding the food, where avoidance does not lead to any harmful effect, leaving aside all of the real and serious problems with quality of life and psychosocial kind of stresses, nothing medically wrong happens with avoidance. So when we're studying a potential treatment which could have an adverse effect, that can be a difficult question to answer, and it makes it sets the bar pretty high for a food allergy treatment to be approved, because when we're comparing it with avoidance where nothing bad's going to happen, you really need to demonstrate that this treatment is worth it, because doing no harm is always our first obligation. So I have a list of references here. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation I just found was very helpful, has a lot of great information about clinical trials, obviously for a different disease, but much of the information is the same. I mentioned FAIR has outstanding information about food allergy in general, but also about clinical research and some good links to learn about food allergy studies, and then a list of other websites as well. So hopefully this list is useful to you. So thank you very much for spending your lunchtime with me. I appreciate you being here, and I really appreciate everything that all of you are doing to help us with food allergy. I think food allergy is a great example of what we can accomplish if we have a group of motivated parents and families and physicians all working together. So I'll take questions now, and I'll turn it over to Lynn.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Green. I know that we have a little bit of time to take some questions. So again, if you have questions for Dr. Green, feel free to go ahead and enter them in using the questions feature on your GoToMeeting little dashboard. One question that is one that we commonly hear from the food allergy community is why, when we're talking about clinical trials and we sort of discuss drugs and treatment, why is FDA approval required for food OIT, since it's not really considered a drug?
Yeah, we get that question a lot. I think it's kind of a complicated question to answer, but as you know, as many of the people on this call know, oral immunotherapy has been studied at a handful of centers, and the initial results have been encouraging. There have been side effects, and it's definitely not a therapy that's going to treat everybody immediately. But the problem with these studies when they're being done in the way they've been done is that the protocols vary, the amounts that are used vary, and so to take results from those studies and then put it into clinical practice is challenging. So to use a food as a treatment and to market it as a treatment would require FDA approval if you're going to develop a product that's going to treat a condition. And so there's benefit in coming up with a product where the dose is uniform and the manufacturing is monitored. So the FDA, when it monitors drug companies, enforces these good manufacturing practices, which make sure that there's quality standards with the product. So by developing a product for food allergy, we can ensure that these GMP practices are satisfied. And having something where the dose is uniform and it's standardized and has met FDA approval also will allow for insurance approval, hopefully, for these products. So those are all kind of the factors that are involved with why, even though it's just a food, why the FDA, having the FDA approval would be necessary. But to get FDA approval, it's a rigorous process.
Great, thank you. It's provides some helpful clarity. And I sort of piggybacking on that, I know that, you know, one of the questions we sometimes see at FAIR is related to treatments that are being studied still in the clinical trial setting for use in private practice. I would just guide people to, on our website, we do have a statement about that and sort of addressing oral immunotherapy for food allergies in the clinical settings and in the private practice settings. And so I'm hopeful that that helps provide a little bit of information as well. I'm just looking to see. A question came through about if there are allergic type reactions that occur during a trial, do we get treatment for managing it from the researchers that are conducting the trial, or would that be done with the child's doctor?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the research team absolutely needs to know about this. It depends on, as far as like where the treatment that minute or that evening or whenever this is happening. It may be a situation where something happens and you need to go to the emergency department and get treatment. But absolutely, you should be on the phone with your center, with your research coordinator, or with your principal investigator. And we need, as investigators, we need to be reporting any type of these adverse effects or events from the study. So these things are monitored. If there are allergic reactions or if there are problems, and the treatment, and we're involved with treating it also. But it may be, I mean, if it's a situation where it's like a anaphylactic reaction and the child needs emergency treatment right there, calling 911 may be appropriate, or going to the emergency department. You know, you really need to treat the child the fastest, best way possible. But and that may or may not involve the research team doing the treatment right then. So I hope that answers that question. But
okay.
But yeah, absolutely, the research team needs to be involved.
Okay, very helpful. And this is a question that's a little bit sciencey based, and it's related to some of the studies on peanut oral immunotherapy. The question is related to sort of the dosage that's used, and the question is inquiring: is there sort of a uniform dose of the proteins of what are thought to be most dangerous, like what component testing tests for, or if you're able to kind of provide a little bit of the how does that work?
Yeah, so the dosing for the OIT studies, is that what?
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the things that's being worked out, is what is the optimum dose. And the same question applies to the epicutaneous immunotherapy. There were initially different doses of the patch studied. And I would say, just speaking in very general terms, like the higher the dose that you're able to administer safely, either orally or epicutaneously, but the higher the dose you can administer, generally the more effective the outcome. The problem is if you go too high, you get worse side effects and you get more allergic reactions from it. So it's finding that right dose. But that's exactly one of the big reasons we need to do these studies, is to figure out what the right dose is. And it may vary based on the age of the patient, or the size of the patient, or the patient's baseline IgE level or skin test size. But that's one of the questions being addressed. And that's one of the reasons to try to develop a product that's FDA approved, where it's going to be a uniform dose, as opposed to taking information from these other studies that have been done that have used really in some cases, pretty doses that vary by pretty significant amounts.
Okay, great. So that actually brings us to time, and I know that Dr. Green has actually taken a break from seeing patients today in order to be with us, and so I want to be respectful of that and mindful of that, and kind of allow him to get back to helping us advance our mission and seeing his patients. But I really would like to thank you, Dr. Green, for joining us today and for your incredibly valuable insights. For anybody that is still here that missed any portion of the presentation, just a reminder that today's webinar has been recorded. It will be available along with our slides as a resource on FAIR's website in the coming days. It usually takes about 7 to 10 days to get up and running. After this webinar and in your post-webinar follow-up email from FAIR, there will be a short survey link that will be included for you to share feedback and to provide comments on webinar topics you'd like to see in the future. So if you could, just please take a minute to complete this and help us continue to deliver meaningful information to you. Next month, as we celebrate Food Allergy Action Month and Food Allergy Awareness Week and promote this year's message of React with Respect, we will be joined by Scott Riccio, FAIR's Senior Vice President of Education and Advocacy and a parent to a child with food allergies. Scott will help inform the public about important food allergy facts and the serious consequences of food allergy reactions, as well as how to identify symptoms, respond in case of an emergency, and to respectfully support the ability of individuals with food allergies to live safe, productive lives. This will be a great webinar not only in support of families who are new to food allergy diagnosis, but also to provide an overview of what friends, extended family, caregivers, and community members should know about food allergies. Priority registration for FAIR members will open this Friday, April 22nd, with general registration opening Tuesday, April 26th. The webinar will be taking place on Wednesday, May 4th, 2016, from 1 to 2 p.m., so just in a couple of weeks as we kick off our Food Allergy Action Month activities. With that, we will conclude today's webinar. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, and we sincerely hope to see you again next month, and special thanks again to you, Dr. Green, for being here.